questions. First thing someone asked was, what is it like to kiss Sam Hewitt? Well, like all of the Scotsmen whom I know with any degree of familiarity, he kisses me every time we meet and every time we leave each other. So he has literally kissed me several dozen times so far. It's fairly uniform. He has a very soft mouth and he uses a lot of lip balm. Maybe because I'm not the only one he kisses. Anyway, thank you so much for the lovely welcome. Everyone's been wonderful today. And I see they have provided me with my own fire exit here. Well, we're all going that way. I'm going this way. Unless, of course, the fire starts under my platform. Thank you also for the lovely furniture. This was described as a very comfy chair, and it certainly is. I'm hoping that I can get out of it to sign books or whatever. Anyway, it is lovely to be here and to see you tonight, and to be with you on the 270th anniversary year of the Battle of Culloden. I was doing an interview this afternoon, and someone was asking, was it terribly important to me, emotionally to be here for the anniversary? And I said, well, I was here for the 250th one, and that was, quite significant. But, I thought it was significant just to be here, regardless of the time. I imagine most of you agree with that. Yeah. Are most of you from locally, from Inverness or thereabouts? Some of you? Yeah. No. Some not from much further afield, I suppose. Yeah. Yeah.
That's great.
So this is wonderful to have people from so far afield and so many and varied. I understand we have the Inverness ladies, is that correct? Yes. I see you cornered the market on tickets. Well, it's my pleasure to be here. When I first started doing this kind of thing years and years ago, my husband would say to me, going out in the evening, he said, well, doesn't it make you nervous going out to talk to all these totally strange people? I think he meant total strangers. And I said, well, it might, but, they've all come on purpose to hear me. And, it's nice of them to show up, It's not quite like going and forcing your opinions on a room of people who don't know you from a hole in the ground, You actually have something to talk about that they might want to hear. I said, it does also remind me of as we got bigger crowds, it reminds me of the days when I used to teach human anatomy and physiology. I used to be a scientist in my previous incarnation. And it was a classroom that held 400 people because it was a popular elective. Everyone took it, including the football team, because they thought it would be easy. And they would always sit together in the front row, sound asleep at 8 o'clock in the morning. I don't know what they'd been doing the night before, but they were always asleep at 8 o'clock in the morning. And so I'd walk into the auditorium and pick up the microphone, look at them, these large inanimate blobs of flesh, and I'd say, today, gentlemen, we're going to discuss the history of contraception. And they'd all start blinking. In days of old, when knights were bold, and condoms not invented, they wrapped old socks around their cocks and babies were prevented. See, my habits are well known. For some reason, I can't drink coffee. It makes me sick. That used to make my father sick, too, so we never had coffee at home. We always drank tea, since my mother's side of the family was English, and so I'm quite used to that. People always look at me and say, well, what are you? And we get a lot of extremely wild guesses. Though since I started writing the books, people keep coming up and saying, well, are you Scottish? Because for some reason, people, I don't say you people, of course, because obviously you are well above average in intelligence, or you wouldn't be here. But a lot of people kind of assume that you should only write things that you have a personal connection with. Like you should write about your own family or about your own ethnicity or whatever. And that's never made any sense to me, both because I have an extremely mixed ethnicity and I would have trouble picking one strand, but also because that's not what a novelist does. Yeah, I said the benefit to being a novelist is that you can be anybody, anytime, anywhere. And, I sit down at my computer and within minutes I, am Jamie Fraser or Claire or young Ian or Lola.
No.
I have a group of fans in Scottsdale where I live who take me out once a year to kind of pick my brains about what I'm writing. They hope to, get an idea when the next book is coming out. And if they can tell, they're smarter than I am because I have no idea. On one of these occasions, they got started on the character of Blackjack Randall. And they were saying, oh, he's so loathsome, he makes my skin crawl, he's so disgusting. And I'm sitting there sipping my Earl Grey and thinking, you have no idea you're talking to Blackjack Randall. The usual question is, well, how much of you is in Claire? To which the statutory answer is 15.3%. I'm all of them. Where else would they come from? It's not as though I know a lot of perverts, and we have to grow them ourselves. So it's that Walt Whitman thing. I am vast. I contain multitudes. Any novelist you're talking to, it's just which side of them are you going to see at any given moment. Yes, mind you, given my physical appearance, people are not afraid to encounter me in a dark alley. Maybe it should be. Anyway, I am not Scottish, for the record. My mother's side, as I say, is mostly English, though with one strand of German that came over as a mercenary during the American Revolution. And even he went by the name Schweitzer, which actually means the guy from Switzerland. So that strain kind of goes off into the murk there. On the other side, though, my dad's people are from New Mexico. And so I tell people this. And this is another odd thing. Maybe it's an American thing, I don't know. But if you have an ethnicity that they perceive as minority in some way, they seize on that. The other side of my family is, they say English, German, whatever. Well, this is boring to them. They say, oh, why don't you write books about Mexico? I said, well, because I'm not a Mexican, for one thing. I said, New Mexico, And, the first Gabaldons came from Spain to Santa Fe, New Mexico, in about 1594. That's the earliest we see them there. And they remained citizens of Spain until the War of Mexican Independence about 300 years later, at which point they became Mexicans for 30 years. At the end of that time, that territory was ceded to the United States by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and they became Americans without moving a step. So make it that way you will, but we weren't Mexicans. But the point here is that I always want to say to them, look, if you had a friend whose grandparents came from Norway or something, would you ask them, why don't you write books about Norway? No, you wouldn't, because you perceive them as white and therefore uninteresting. Whereas you think people who are of color or have an unusual ethnicity, etc., well, they ought to be writing about that ethnicity for some reason. And they don't limit, people of generally European, Caucasian ancestry in that way. Obviously, if you come from that, you could write about anybody because they expect you just to be diffuse and have interests everywhere. Whereas if you're a minority, you're supposed to be a minority. To which I say, poppycock. I'm told that term only came into use in 1802, so I'm not allowed to use it. I know this because I did use it in an excerpt I posted last night. Someone wrote to me this morning to tell me that. I kind of rely on the kindness of strangers to catch various hits and things. Really, I post excerpts online because I like people to read them. I like to know what people think about what I write. And since it takes me 3 or 4 years to finish writing the book, that's a long time to go with delayed gratification. So, I post little bits and pieces as we go along, though trying not to spoil anything. And sometimes I am saved from my own ignorance by doing so, not only with poppycock and its provenance, but in the last book, Moby, which is what I call Written in My Own Heart's Blood. There's a scene where Brianna has gone to rescue Jem at the dam, and the police show up with their lights flashing. Well, she's an American, I'm an American, and so I'd written that with describing the pulsing red and white lights spilling across the gravel. Luckily, I posted that excerpt, or a small bit of it, and someone said, but police cars in Benton don't have red and white lights, they're blue. Well, who knew? It never occurred to me that that possibly you had differently colored police cars. I mean, you could find out anything, but you have to know you don't know it first. Yeah, so anyway, being a novelist is, partly a matter of research and finding things out. People say, which is a stupid thing to say, but they say, write what you know. Well, this is dumb, this is what leads people to say, why don't you write books about Mexico? It's because they assume I know that, which I don't. But it's not true. What they should say is, don't write what you don't know. In other words, don't approach something from a position of total ignorance. Go and find out. But you can find out almost anything. And all you have to do is go look for it. And I find usually if you're engaged in a pursuit of something, knowledge or an artistic passion or something, usually the universe will come out to meet you. And somebody will pop up out of a trap and tell you that police cars in Britain are called blueberries. There you are. Anyway, people ask, well, how did you get started? Or rather, follow on from that. Why do you write books set in Scotland then, if you're not Scottish and so forth? Have you ever been in Scotland? Well, I had not when I wrote Outlander. I was, as I say, a university professor at the time. I was a biologist and had a sort of a checkered career. I started out with a degree in just zoology and then went to the Scripps Institution of Oceanography and became a marine biologist for a couple of years. So I got a master's degree. I studied hermit crabs, which is great preparation for absolutely nothing. A picturesque resume item. And then what happened was that I had fallen in love with a young gentleman at my first school at Northern Arizona University. We sat down next to each other in the French horn section, and he was a tall redhead, and that was it. And the only complication was that I was engaged to someone else at the time. But after 90 minutes of random conversation about music holders and so forth, I went back and gave my boyfriend back his ring. So it took a little longer to actually unravel, but that's pretty much the size of it. And I've had him for 44 years, so it worked. And those tall redheads have a lot of lasting power. So where was I? Oh, yes. Academic career. There's a reason why I write long books, is because I like digressions. No, having fallen in love with Doug in my senior year, he was still a sophomore at that point, having lain out of school for a couple of years before coming back to college. I went to San Diego to take up my master's degree work there, and he was still in Flagstaff. Well, it's a 6-hour drive between San Diego and Flagstaff, well, actually 9 hours. I think I made it more than once. And he had an ancient old VW Bug, which would not make that trip. I had a brand new Ford Pinto, which would. And so I drove that round trip every weekend to see him for about a year and a half. So as I got toward the end of my master's work, I said, well, if I go ahead and get a PhD in marine biology, there will only be 6 cities I can live in for the rest of my life. And I will have to go on driving back and forth for another year or two. And I said, on the other hand, if I switch back to NAU and go into land biology for a PhD, we can get married, and I can live anywhere I want. So that's what I did. And consequently, I wrote a PhD dissertation entitled Nest Site Selection in the Pinyon Jay, Gymnorinus cyanocephalus. Or as my husband says, why birds build nests where they do, and who cares anyway? Well, despite all this, I had sort of slid sideways into being an expert in scientific computation. It's really easy to be an expert if there's only 6 people in the world who do what you do, and that was my position at the time. This was because I had gotten a job without a job description. I was hired by a small department at Arizona State University, and they said, well, we have this position, but it's soft money, meaning it's allocated by the legislature every year. If we don't spend it, they'll take it away again, so you're hired. I said, we want you to design your own research, but while you're doing that, would you help Bob here, the assistant director, with his data? I said, Bob's got 10 years worth of data in cardboard boxes in his back office, and you have a background in computers, meaning that I had 1 class in Fortran programming, but it was 1 class more than any of them had. And so they said, so you can help him get his data into the computer. This was 1982, when they thought you just unscrewed the top and poured the data in. And so I spent the next 18 months of my life writing Fortran programs to analyze the contents of bird gizzards. This actually has something to do with how I became a novelist. That's that's the other reason why I write long books, is because I have these little chains, and things pop up here that you don't realize are important until you run into them again 3 books down, that sort of thing. That's where it comes from. Anyway, as I say, came out of this with an 840-page monograph entitled Dietary Habits of the Birds of the Colorado River Valley, and a strong desire to have nothing to do with gizzards anymore. But I also came out of it with enough skill to be able to do something with it. And what I did was to look at my 18 months worth of Fortran programs and say, there's maybe 5 other people in the world who are interested in bird gizzards, but it would save every one of those 5 people 18 months worth of work if they knew about these programs. Why is there no channel by which we can share this information? So the long and the short of that was I put newsletters in all of the newsletters of the scientific societies I knew. I put in a little notice explaining what I'd done, saying, I know there's other people who do this sort of thing. And you write to me, we can put together a little newsletter of our own. Well, I got 300 letters from people saying, this is amazing, why has no one ever thought of this? And so I took those to my director and said, look, I'm not having any luck getting grant money, but I think I've started something. Can you front me a little money from petty cash and I'll see what I can do? So he gave me $250. I had some pamphlets printed up describing my theoretical journal called Science Software Quarterly, and went to a scientific convention and handed them out. And within a month, I'd raised enough for charter subscriptions to get it off the ground, and I ran and percolated into international science computation and how to automate labs and things like that. Yes, which actually does have something to do with how I got published. Because this expertise, in turn, allowed me to start freelancing for the computer network. Now, my father, who was very conservative, used to say to me when I was young, you're such a poor judge of character, you're bound to marry some bum. And so be sure you get a good education so you can support your children. Obviously, he didn't know how badly biologists are paid or anything like that. But as it is, I got a good education, and I got a good husband who was not a bum. But he married me, and then, well, he's still with me 44 years later, too. But he did quit work 3 months after our first child was born in order to start his own business. And I will say that there's not much to choose between an entrepreneur and a bum in terms of income. So I was our sole support for several years, and we kept on having children. So they really don't pay assistant professors very much, and so I thought, well, there must be some means of making money other than prostitution in the home, So I said, what do I know how to do? Well, I'm reasonably articulate, I can write relatively well, and I know a lot about personal computers, because that's what my husband's business did. They did customized programming for these personal computers, or PCs as they were then called. And so I did quite a bit about that. And so I sent query letters to the editors of Byte and InfoWorld, all the PC magazines, and enclosed with it a copy of my Science Software Quarterly and a copy of a comic book that I'd written for Walt Disney Educational Productions called Nutrition Adventures with Orange Bird. It was a very short query letter. It said, dear sirs, as you can see from the enclosed, you won't find anyone who knows more about scientific and technical software than I do, and at the same time can write so as to appeal to a broad popular audience. Well, so I got immediate results from this, and within a year I was making as much freelancing as I was from the university. And we went on supporting our family in reasonably decent style. We all kept eating, and things went on quite well. But in the course of my freelance career, I was sent a software package by Mac Magazine, and with it, they sent me a trial membership to something called CompuServe. This was 1985. The internet didn't exist. It does now. The World Wide Web was not even a dream in anyone's eye. This was even before America Online. But what we did have were 3 information services, as they called themselves: Delphi, Genie, and CompuServe. The other 2 have perished. CompuServe still exists, so it's rather rudimentary in how many people have still heard of it. But it had a number of what they were called special interest groups to support, car fanatics or gardeners or whatever. And so they sent me a trial membership to this, and they said, well, this manufacturer of software, they have an online support forum on CompuServe. And in 1985, this was the coolest, sexiest thing anyone had ever heard of. That you could get online advice about your misbehaving software. And so they said they want you to mention it. So I went along to mention it. And then I had 4 hours of free connect time left. And I said, what else is in here? So I tiptoed through CompuServe and found the Literary Forum, which is a group of people who liked books. There were some published authors, some unpublished authors, there were a lot of readers, but these were all, highly intelligent, literate people who liked to talk about books and writing. And for someone with 2 full-time jobs and 3 small children, it was the ideal social life. So I joined up, and began talking to them every night. And as I say, I had 3 small children and so forth, and the 2 full-time jobs. I'd been on CompuServe for about a year when I decided that now was the ideal time to start writing a novel. And that was because I turned 35. And I had known from a very early age that I was supposed to write novels. I just didn't know how. I mean, it doesn't come with a well-marked career path like being a lawyer or a dentist or a CPA. You don't just take classes and an examination and being a novelist. You make it up as you go. In fact, I like to talk to other novelists and say, well, when did you know you were a novelist? Almost all of them knew from quite an early age, 7 or 8. I was about 8 when I realized that. But it took every one of them a long time to figure out how to go about it. I asked Ian Rankin that once because I've been reading his books for a long time, and his little biography in the back always said he'd had multiple careers before writing novels, including tax collector and swineherd. So I got to interview him at a book signing once, and I said, so Ian, I've always wondered, how did you become a swineherd, and why did you quit? I said, well, he and his wife, who were quite young at the time, in their early 20s, had taken jobs on a French winemaking estate. She was the domestic servant, and he managed the outside duties, including taking care of the pigs. And he said when they harvested the grapes, it was very old-fashioned. They did actually all strip off and stomp the grapes in vats and get drunk and have a good time. So he said they joined in, of course, with this, and everybody was so drunk at the end, including him, that they just went off to bed and left the wineskins, in the vats after they drained the juice. And so he woke up sometime later realizing that he had not fed the pigs, went out and seeing the vats full of wineskins, just threw them to the pigs. And the pigs all died of alcohol poisoning. Which is how he became a crime writer. But as I say, we'll come to it through different ways. And as I say, I'd been thinking about it for a long time, but when I turned 35, what I thought was, once art was dead at 36, maybe you better get a move on just in case. And so I decided on my next birthday I would begin writing a book. I wasn't going to publish it or try to publish it. I wasn't going to tell anyone what I was doing, partly because my husband would have tried to stop me, not out of any objection to my writing a book, but out of fear that I would drop dead, with the 2 full-time jobs and the 3 small children under 6. And so I didn't tell him or anyone else. I said, this is just for practice. What I need to do is learn how to write a novel, and I think the only way to do that is to write a novel. Because up to this point, I had written all kinds of other things, science software, quarterly dissertations, monographs on dietary habits for the birds of the Colorado River Valley, comic books. No one had ever shown me how to write any of this stuff. I just looked at a few examples, wrote one, and if it didn't look quite right, I hoped it till it did. I said, well, fine, you've been reading novels for 30-odd years. Surely if you write one, you will recognize it. So I said, okay, I'm going to write a novel. Well, then I can decide whether I want to do this or not. So the next question was, what sort of novel shall I write? Because I read everything and lots of it. And I was thinking, well, I read a lot of mysteries. Maybe I should write mysteries. And I thought, no, mysteries have plots. I'm not sure I can do that. So I probably never had. So I said, okay, what's the easiest kind of book I could write for practice? And I said, well, after some consideration, I thought that might be historical fiction. Because I was a research professor. I knew my way around a library. I said, it seems easier to look things up than to make them up. And if I turn out to have no imagination, I can steal things from the historical record, which actually works pretty well. And so I said, all right, historical fiction, where shall I set it? Because history is a big thing, you have to pick a point. And so I was thinking, Venice, 15th century, American Civil War, what sounds interesting here? And in this malleable frame of mind, I happened to see a really old episode of Doctor Who on public television. And this being Great Britain, I'm pretty sure you all know who Doctor Who is, and so I don't have to stop and explain that. Well, the Doctor, as you may recall, has companions from different periods of Earth's history. And in this really old episode, which has to have been done 60 years ago, he had picked up a young companion from Scotland in 1745 named Jamie McCrimmon, a 18, 19-year-old young man who appeared in his kilt. And I said, well, that's kind of fetching. And I found myself still thinking about this the next day in church. And I said, when you write a book, it doesn't really matter where you start it. The important thing is to pick a point, get going. So I said, fine, Scotland, 18th century, why not? And so that's where I began, with no plot, no outline, no knowledge of Scotland or the 18th century, just the rather vague images conjured up by the notion of a man in a kilt, which is, of course, a very powerful and compelling image. At one point, after I'd begun writing for a while, I was fortunate enough to win an important literary prize in Germany called the Corina International Prize for Fiction, and got to go to Germany to accept it. Well, during this outing, the German publisher was so excited that they signed me up for every interview going during this book festival. So for a week, I was interviewed every half hour or so all day by everybody in the German press. And toward the end of this week, I was just sort of swaying from fatigue, but found myself talking to a gentleman from a literary journal. And he said, "Oh, I'm so excited, I've read all of your books, you know, your imagery is just transcendent, your characters are so three-dimensional." I'm going, "Yes, yes, go on." Instead, he paused and said, "There's just this one thing. I wonder, could you explain to me, what is the appeal of a man in a kilt?" Well, he was German and a man, and I said, I was really tired, I might not have said it, but I looked at him for a minute and I said, "Well, I suppose it's the idea that you could be up against a wall with him in a minute." Well, that actually is why. But anyway, some weeks later I was at home and got this pile of press clippings from this German junket. I do read German, but very slowly. And on top was this particular interview. And the publisher had put a Post-it note on it, and she said, "I don't know what you told this man, but I think he is in love with you." So anyway, that's where Outlander started, was with the man in a kilt and nothing else. So I went to the library immediately to find out what else. And the only thing that I knew at that point about writing novels was that they should have conflict. So I said, well, what kind of conflict did we have in Scotland in the 18th century? Well, you don't have to look very far before you find out what there was. It was the 45 and Charles Stuart. I said, well, that looks like lots of conflict. Okay, we'll use that. And so I said, well, we must have a lot of Scotsmen because of the kilt factor, of course. But I think it would be a good idea if I had a female character to play off these guys, and they'll have sexual tension. That's good. And so I said, on my basis of 3 days research at this point, I said it looks like it was English versus Scots, so if I make her an English woman, we will have lots of conflict. And so the third day of writing, I introduced this English woman. No idea who she was, what she was doing, how she got into the story, but I loosed her into a cottage full of Scotsmen to see what she'd do. And they all turned around and stared at her when she walked in. And I thought, why does she look funny? What's going on? Well, one of them drew himself up and said, "My name's Dougal Mackenzie, and who might you be?" And without my stopping to think, I just typed, "My name's Claire Elizabeth Beecham, and who the hell are you?" And I said, "Well, you don't sound at all like an 18th century person." And so I fought with her for several pages, trying to beat her into shape and make her talk like an 18th century person. She wasn't having any, she just kept making smart-ass modern remarks. And she also took over and started telling the story herself. And so I said, well, I'm not going to fight with you all the way through this book. I said, no one's ever going to see this. It doesn't matter what bizarre thing I do. Go ahead and be modern. I'll figure out how you got there later. So it's all her fault that there's time travel in this book. Yeah, so to date, since I wrote that book for practice, I had no genre in mind. I didn't need one because no one was ever going to see it. And I read everything, as I said. So I used everything. Consequently, I have seen my books sold with evident success as literature, fiction, historical fiction, science fiction, fantasy, those are actually different things, mystery, romance, military history, gay and lesbian fiction, and horror. It's actually true. I once was nominated for a Quill Award in a category called Fantasy Science Fiction Horror, and I was up against both George R.R. Martin and Stephen King, and I beat them both. That's where I first became friends with George R.R. Martin, because I was wearing 4-inch suede heels to this. It was held in the Natural History Museum in New York, and they kept everyone standing in the foyer for 3 hours while they finished the setup for the TV. And so my feet were killing me by the time I sat down, and so I unzipped my boots and took them off under the table. Well, we were working our way through this very long program. That category was the very last one, and I was sitting there thinking, what are the odds? Should I put my shoes back on? I was looking at George across the table and Stephen across the room, thinking, nah. So, of course, I won. And I had to scamper up on stage barefoot because I didn't have time to put my shoes on. So I was so rattled by this that I hadn't prepared anything to say. So I just blurted the first thing in my mind, which was, you really should have given this award to George Martin because he actually writes this stuff. Anyway, that went over fairly well with George. So we've been friends ever since. But anyway, in not very short form, returning for the nonce to CompuServe. I mean, all connections really do hook up somewhere. I had not meant to tell anyone there what I was doing when I began writing a book, because I've seen a lot of people come through the forum and to talk about their project. I'm going to write this, I'm going to write that, and I'm going to do research here, and I'm going to Greece to facts. And they would never write a word. They just like to talk about writing or think about writing or do research. Research is the best form of procrastination for a historical writer. And I knew that, which is why I began writing immediately rather than collecting 10 years of research. I do the writing and the researching concurrently because they feed off each other. I will be writing about a battle, for instance, and I need to know this particular bit of information. I go and look it up, and while I'm finding that out, I stumble across 3 or 4 other things that would make great scenes, and I write those for more research and so on. So this is the other reason why my books are very big. It's because I can't stop. It's like salted peanuts. Anyway, there's always more to find out, and in fact, some nice lady just brought me several more interesting nuggets of information while I was waiting to come on, and not things that I knew existed, and suddenly there they are. Anyway, as I say, when you do this stuff, the universe comes out to meet you, and that was true in this case as well. I was not, as I say, going to tell people what I was doing, but I'd been writing on this putative novel for about 8 months, and working in the middle of the night, because that's how you work when you have small children and 2 jobs. And I found that I was having a desultory argument with a gentleman on CompuServe about what it feels like to be pregnant. Well, a bit of back and forth, he said, oh, I know what that's like. My wife's had 3 children. I laughed. And I said, yeah, Buster, I've had 3 children. And he said, well, can you tell me what it's like? I said, I can, yes. But it's kind of complex. I don't know that I could fit it in a 30-line message slot, which is what we had. I said, but I tell you what, I have this small piece that I wrote a few months ago in which a young woman explains to her brother what it's like to be pregnant. And that, of course, is Jenny explaining to her brother Jamie from Outlander. Anyway, I said, I'll put it in the library here and you could read it. So I did. And everyone who had read the argument went and read this piece. And they all came rushing back and they said, well, this is great, what is it? And I said, I don't know. They said, well, where's the beginning? And I said, I haven't written that. And they said, well, put up some more of it, this is fascinating. And so this is like heroin to have somebody actually want to read what you write, especially if you've never been in that position before. So, I was really jazzed. And so I don't write with an outline, and I don't write in a straight line. I write where I can see things happening, and then gradually all the little pieces kind of grow fuzzy, sticky feet and stick together, and then I have a bigger piece, and something else sticks to that, and it's very organic. Also why it takes a long time to write. But I have lots of excuses. But anyway, I would put up a piece for them every time I had a scene that would stand alone without a lot of explanation, which happened every 2 or 3 or 4 months. And so I went on putting these up, and they called them Diana's chunks, and they would say, oh, Diana has a new chunk, have you read it yet? And they'd all come and read it and get excited and talk to me about it, and other people would go and read it, and it kind of picked up momentum. And after a while, people began saying to me, this is great, you should try and publish it. And I said, well, I don't even know what kind of book it is, and I think I should probably know that, but eventually I'm going to write a book that I want to publish, so, how should I do it? Well, I knew a number of published writers at this point, and they respected what I was doing, knew I was serious. So they were very kind about sharing their information. And they all said, the literary agent, is that an agent can do 2 things for you. He or she can get your book read much more quickly than if you're sending it into a slush pile, because they know all the editors, and they know what each editor is kind of in the market for, so they can match you up and send it to editors who will probably like at least the sort of stuff that you write, even if they don't like your book. And they said if it does sell, then the agent can negotiate a much better contract for you than you can do by yourself, which is also totally true. Literary contracts are just huge and Byzantine. I have no idea of the bizarre rights that go along with a book. I didn't even know I had foreign rights until my foreign agent called me one day to introduce himself and tell me he'd sold my book to Sweden, at which I blurted, "You can do that?" Apparently you can. We are now sold in 42 countries and 38 languages, which is pretty good. So anyway, that's where I was at that point. And so I said, well, okay, how do you find an agent? And they gave me various information. And I began asking people on CompuServe that I knew, whenever I was in conversation with them, do you have an agent? If you do, would you tell me about it? And anyway, one man that I talked to named John Stith had an agent who I had my eye on as a potential possibility for me, because I'd learned from other people's conversation that he wasn't afraid of very long books or of unorthodox books, both of which it occurred to me I had. And so I thought he might be a good match, but he didn't take unsolicited queries. You had to be recommended to him by someone. So I was asking this one man, do you have an agent? And he said, well, yeah, by coincidence, it's the same so-and-so. His name is Perry Knowlton. And I was going, oh. And he said, I know you're almost ready to look for an agent. Would you like me to introduce you to Perry? I said, that would be very nice, John. And so I was afraid John would leave CompuServe or be run over by a bus before I finished the book. So I said, yes, go ahead. And so he sent a note to Perry to say I was worth looking at. Well, I followed that with my own brief query and said, dear Mr. Knowlton, I've been writing and selling my own fiction, my own nonfiction, for several years now. In other words, yes, I am a professional writer, and people will actually pay me for it. And you've been recommended to me by John and Judy and all these other people whose opinions I respect, all of whom think you walk on water. I said, I have this very long historical novel. I don't want to waste your time. Would you be willing to read excerpts from it? And I didn't tell him I wasn't through writing it. Actually, that's all I had. But he very kindly called back and said, yes, you'd be happy to read my excerpt. I hastily 6-page single-space synopsis. Synopses are supposed to be like 2 pages, double-spaced. And sent it to him along with my pile of excerpts. And he took me on the basis of an unpublished first novel, which wasn't finished. And that's kind of unusual now. It was unusual then, but very lucky. Anyway, I finally finished it 6 months later and sent it to him, and he sent it to 5 editors who he thought might like it. Well, 4 days later, 3 of them had called back with offers to buy it. He negotiated amongst them for 2 weeks. They merged with a 3-book contract, and thinking I was a novelist. So in not very short order, that's how I got published.